Okay, welcome everyone to the first forum of semester. We're having our apologetics block for the next 4 weeks or so, and we're beginning with Andy Prideaux on the intolerance of tolerance, which should be fascinating. So I'll leave it to Andy to start us off.
Thank you. Thank you to the forum team for the kind invitation to speak on this topic. Not because I'm an expert, they thought I might have something to say. So I was a student here in the early 90s, almost 30 years ago. You can ask Helen how long ago she was a student here, that's up for her to tell you that. And I studied classical and Near Eastern studies, so I overheard somebody talking about Egyptian, Mesopotamian stuff. I did that kind of stuff, which I loved, and some philosophy and English. Went on to do theology, a couple of theological degrees a bit later on. This is a really important topic for us to grapple with, I think, whatever we're studying, whatever we're doing, not only if you're an art student, but any kind of student. I love this theatre. I just want to make that clear. We'll finally get to meet Dr. Love. Many people ask me who Dr. Love is. There he is. He turned out to be a professor of mathematics. There you go. Wasn't romantic poetry after all. So I hope you feel the love in the Love Theatre. And it's also great because I get to use technology, which even I can use, like putting things like that, and also chalk. Chalk is great. And I can't believe there are still chalkboards at the university. I think that's fantastic. Anyway, that has nothing to do with the topic. You should all have it's a fairly detailed thing, so it's a resource. Don't panic. We're not going to do every word that's written on there. It's quite detailed because I'm basically Don Carson, an American, a Canadian actually, a Christian academic and New Testament scholar, but also a great apologist for the Christian faith, just a great thinker, wrote this book called The Intolerance of Tolerance. I don't know if the Forum Committee were thinking of this when they came to the topic, but I'm using this book as a springboard. More than that, actually, I want us to engage with Carson's argument, his critique. We'll get to that in a moment, but hence the book, and there it is. The book didn't emerge in a vacuum. Here's where I can use the wonderful thing. Whoop, that side. So, a very famous book was written in the late 1940s. It was first a series of lectures and then a book by a guy called Niebuhr. I can never pronounce his surname. I hope that's okay. Called Christ and Culture. And he himself was building on thought by the German academic Troeltsch, who wrote a book called The Social Teachings of the Christian Churches. And basically what these writers were trying to do was make sense of Christianity and other religions for that matter, but they're speaking as Christians, claim a kind of uniqueness for the Christian faith within history. How can that be? So Troeltsch was fairly liberal in his views, and he wanted to say that we actually can't get past relativity. As subjects in history, even with our scriptures, we can't get out of that relatively. It's kind of a nascent or early embryonic version of postmodernism there. There's a relativity here. We're part of that. We can't get beyond it. Niebuhr wanted to build on that. He said, well, with all due respect, I understand what he's saying, and we have to acknowledge our finiteness, that there's a historical relativism that we can't get past. But he says that if we're believers, and indeed even if we're not believers, we tend to assume some kind of supra-historical thing that's happening. So for him, he wanted to say, look, yes, there's a kind of relativism, but that needs to be seen, speaking as a believer, for him, in the context of an absolute God over that. So we might be, as it were, stuck in a maze of relativity, but we can know the God who is above that. So he's saying that it's right to talk about a meta-narrative in that way, to use sort of modern, postmodern jargon. And in this book, he was trying to navigate, and this is all of these quotes are written on your sheet, you can have a look at them later, the double wrestle of the church with its Lord, so the supra-historical one overall, with the cultural society which it lives in symbiosis. How do we navigate this? We're living in the world, but we're not of the world, to quote Jesus. What does that actually mean for the way that we think, the way that we reason, the way that we do life, the way that we construct worldview? He said there's a number of models you can have, and he summarised them in his book. You can have the model of Christ against culture, that the things of God are always critiquing culture, so critiquing condemnation. Another way you can go is you can say, no, we want to talk about the Christ of culture. We want to see what is in common and what Christ affirms about culture. Dialogue and accommodation. Now someone else might say, no, we actually want Christ above culture. That is, there is a synthesis between Christ and culture, but we want to acknowledge that there's that Christ is over culture in some way. Other people might say, no, the whole thing is fraught. Christ and culture are always in paradox. There's a kind of dualism. What has Athens got to do with Jerusalem? I think Tertullian said. That we're never going to get beyond that fight. Where he lands is, no, let's talk about Christ, the transformer of culture. We affirm what we can affirm, but the culture is a work in progress, as human beings are a work in progress. And so Christians talk about conversion, and they talk about new creation. Now Don Carson comes along, and he says, yes, this seminal book was a seminal book for a reason, very important, but he wants to build on that. He's coming from a theology which is seeking to be more firmly based in biblical thought. He's a confessedly reformed evangelical guy, and he's upfront about how that affects the way that he understands these things. He wrote a book called Christ and Culture Revisited, which is obviously picking up Niebuhr but saying, hey, I want to do some other things here. I want to challenge some things. I want to build on some things that were good. And he writes this. This is a quote from the preface in that book, and this is on your sheets there. He writes, Christians have found themselves in an incredible diversity of situations, persecuted and reigning, isolated and dominant, ignorant and well-educated, highly distinguishable from the surrounding culture, virtually indifferentiable from it, impoverished and wealthy, evangelistically zealous and evangelistically dormant, social reformers and supportive of the social status quo, hungry for heaven and hoping it won't arrive too soon. All of these polarised possibilities, he writes, reflect diverse cultural self-understanding. Inevitably, in most generations, Christians have pondered where their attitudes ought to be. And so as you read through those, you might want to think, well, where are we at the moment in that? So most people would say that certainly in Europe, Europe is well and truly post-Christian. Most of the great cathedrals are now museums that you pay entry to go in and marvel at the architecture, but there's only about 3 people gathered for worship there each Sunday. I exaggerate, but there's a lot of big empty churches in Europe. Take that as a symbol. I skipped over this, but the Marxist observer, who if you're an art student, you may have to read primary docs. Max Weber, is it? Or I think it's Weber, not Weber. I think it is. This is going back to the start there. He had this observation. You can take it or leave it. He said the church sets itself up as a part of culture. So the church sets itself up as part of culture. So when we talk about church, building, denomination, history, institution, part of culture, part of the ethical framework. The church sets itself up as part of the culture, while the sect sets itself up as something over against culture. No, we don't want to identify with that. we're going to go out into the desert, form an alternative community, and we're going to critique everything. Okay. Even if we want to borrow something of that, maybe we want to say, in Australia, are we becoming, I'm saying we, as a Christian I'm saying that, are we entering a sect phase in Australia and the West? That is, even if we know that we're not just a sect, right, we belong to the Church Universal through the ages, we don't want to accept that title for ourselves, but are we increasingly being perceived as a kind of sect, a dangerous sect? So when I was growing up, in the olden days when Helen and I were at university, maybe you could ignore the Christians as they're doing their Christian thing. Let them do their Christian thing. Every now and then they'll do a loud mission. We might find that annoying, but we can ignore Christians most of the time, or the church. But has it shifted a bit? 30 years later, dare I say it, has it shifted so that it's actually, we don't want to ignore, we want to critique. Like these Christians are intolerant. We're getting closer to the subject here. They are intolerant, and we don't tolerate that. And so, building on that book, and here let's get to the topic. That would be a good thing. I've got Mickey Mouse there to remind me what the time is, and all of us. So there is an end in sight. He writes this book in 2012, so a few years later, and he's saying, look, what I'm doing here is I'm not sort of necessarily adding to the argument in Christ and Culture Revisited, but I want to start and make some specific observations about the times in which we live and suggest some ways forward. So I'll just block off Mickey Mouse for a second. Actually, yeah, that sort of works. So he writes this book, The Intolerance of Tolerance. It's only 176 pages long. I put that there because I think it's good to read books while you're at university. I think this is a book worth reading. You'll probably read it fairly... Actually, by the end of this, I've plagiarised so much you might think, yeah, no, it's worth reading. And the way I would summarise it is that it's a polemical work. That is, there's stuff he wants to challenge, like he's got an axe to grind, and he's upfront about that. It's polemical work. Polemical just means fighting. It's a cultural critique. He wants to critique particularly where culture is in the States. So he's speaking as someone he's a Canadian, he teaches and works in the States, but he travels around the world and teaches and lectures, but that's where he's coming from. He's a English-speaking, French-speaking Canadian who teaches in the States, if you want to get his background. And he wants, this is the very brief, the last chapter, he wants to suggest a way forward, and he has 10 words, which is a little bit cheeky because the 10 Commandments are sometimes called 10 words. But anyway, I've thought about that before. His thesis, if I hope you don't want to fall asleep, because there's only a few of you here, I'll be really obvious, but if you do, the thesis basically is, and this is where he gets most passionate and he's most concerned, and we might want to say, hey, you're overreacting, you're getting a bit excited. But I think what he's saying is, look, when tolerance, newly defined, we'll get on to that, the definitions are important, when tolerance, so defined, becomes an absolute value in a worldview, that is a way of constructing how we make sense of the world and existence, in a culture, in a community, it becomes a form of tyranny. He would argue it becomes a form of intellectual tyranny. When it's held as an absolute value, you cease to think clearly. He would argue that when it's then applied, it becomes a tyrannical value in terms of what happens with those who don't agree. It suddenly becomes intolerant, hence the title of his book, The Intolerance of Tolerance. He's wanting to expose what he sees as a hypocrisy in the sloganeering of, yes, don't judge, it's all good, tolerance, that's what it's all about. That's sort of what he's saying in summary. Now, have a look at these quotes here, and I'm going to give you a break from my voice for 2 minutes exactly. Here's 2 quotes, and you can, one of them's a little bit longer, one of them's only 3 words long. You can choose which one you want to talk with the person next to you, or with 3 people, or whatever works. First one is Billy Connolly, the great Scottish comedian, who now travels around and does these travelling shows and has interesting conversations with people with a humorous edge. It's quite enjoyable to watch. On one that I watched recently on commercial TV, I don't know when it was produced, it's a couple of years old, I heard these words. Billy Connolly said, "I have travelled the world and met and spent quality time with all sorts of people from different cultures and walks of life, and my discovery as an ageing hippie," he says, "is that the world would be a better place if only religious people were more tolerant. Explore, discover, enjoy, don't judge. Vive la différence." Pardon my French. Or you could just talk about this statement, "It's all good. It's all good." Discuss. 2 minutes. Person next to you. Go. Connolly or Joe/Joanne Citizen, it's all good. Okay, I'm going to interrupt you. I apologise for that. Now, what are some thoughts there? Firstly, what do we want to affirm? Those of you who did the Billy Connolly quote, if there were any, or it's good if you want, but let's start with the Billy Connolly. What do you want to affirm about this? Do we just want to say, no, you know what you're talking about? Or do we want to say, okay, you've got a point? Firstly, what do we want to affirm?
Doesn't the Bible say that we are to judge?
Yeah. So there is a danger in judging others, which Jesus pointed out. Yeah. It's interesting, Jesus gives advice for how to judge those. So he first remove the log in your own eye so that you can see clearly the speck in your brother's eye. So there's a particular kind of judging that Jesus warns about and rules out without ruling out all judgment altogether. So, for example, Jesus has some very harsh critiques about, for example, religious pride and hypocrisy, etc., etc. But, point taken, yeah, there is a danger in going through cultures and saying, I don't like that, that's different to me, that's not how you're meant to do it. I don't like that, that's not how you do it, that's not how you organise society. Everyone should have a democracy. So yeah, well, there's some things we agree with there. Anything else you'd want to affirm or sort of you'd want to tease out a bit with Billy? You know, once you got beyond the jokes, I think you'd be up for a conversation.
Well, we, like as Christians, also celebrate difference. And
Yep.
we like to explore and discover and enjoy. Like God's given us a very diverse world, and
Yes.
where Christians come from all different backgrounds, and so we do want to celebrate that.
Yeah, definitely. There's a good kind of pluralism. God is into variety. He created variety. When we try to do the Tower of Babel thing, let's all have this monolithic empire and build our ziggurat or whatever it was, ask Ben later on, he's the archaeology man, and have one language. God says, no! And even in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be people from every tribe, language and nation. They'll all be able to understand each other, presumably, if Pentecost is something to go by. But those differences are not wiped out. It's extraordinary when you think about it, that God values that. And we believe that the Bible can be the Word of God and translated into every language. It doesn't have to be in one language. We would disagree strongly with Islam on that point. That you don't have to have it doesn't have to be in Arabic or in our case Hebrew and Greek. Variety is a good gift of God. Yeah, definitely. That's right. Yeah. So a lot, if you're on holidays with Billy Connolly, I think it'd be a lot of fun because he's pretty adventurous. He likes talking to different people. Yeah. Get out of your comfort zone. Eat a live scorpion. That's good. Yeah. Maybe not. What about? Do we want to nudge towards a critique here, or am I being too harsh on Billy to suggest that we should critique him?
Well, wouldn't possibly the exploring and discovering and enjoying be a bit worldly? Or it could verge on being worldly. So, for instance, if he says, as an aging hippie, and then we think about, like, sex and all of these other things, and then we say, okay, well, this is fun and this is great and this is enjoyable, but is this in line with the Word of God? Yeah,
that's right. So there's It's hard not to be a little bit cynical when Billy was saying this, he was on the yacht scooting across the thing. Here is the quintessential rich Westerner who can travel wherever he wants in the world, and he's passing through cultures and saying, oh, I love that, I love that, I love that. There's something a little bit superficial about and safe about that. Is there, I don't know if I'm taking us in a slightly different direction here, but is there something a little bit at least superficial about that? Like, is there a real understanding here of the differences? Like, Billy, if you really lived with that tribe for a period of years, would there be nothing that you would want to critique? Maybe about the way they treat women? I haven't even named the tribe, or whatever. Like, I think there can be, and even a Western superiority about that basically everything's the same, and we understand that because we're enlightened Westerners. But there's a lot of people around the world who actually don't think that, who want to say, hey, well, I'm not sure how well that philosophy is doing, actually. When I look at the West and your inability to come up with objective moral basis, I'm not sure how well that's working. I want to critique that. That's your Western thing. It's not my thing. What about the it's all good? It's all good. Am I just being a bit silly there? I'm not going to ask you about that one. I will though quote from another ageing hippie who was one of the prophets of postmodernism, the great Bob Dylan. And he recently, or not so recently, wrote a song, 2009. This is on the final page of your notes, but I'll just read a couple of verses. This is his cheeky response to people who keep telling him it's all good. I'll jump to verse 6 of the song. The widow's cry, the orphan's plea, everywhere you look more misery. Come along with me, babe, I wish you would. You know what I'm saying, it's all good. It's all good, I said it's all good. Cold-blooded killer stalking the town. Cop cars blinking, something's bad's going down. Buildings are crumbling in the neighbourhood, but there's nothing to worry about because it's all good. I'll pluck off your beard and blow it in your face. This time tomorrow I'll be rolling in your place. I wouldn't change a thing even if I could. You know what they say? They say it's all good. There's Bob now, the grumpy old man, saying, sorry kids, I don't think it's all good. I want to discriminate about some things. Maybe you do too. Anyway, let's keep going. Page 2. We're back to page 2. Here's Carson's assertion, his observation. Tolerance currently occupies a very high place in Western culture. It is considered rather gauche, rude or something to question it. It's a bit like questioning the statement sexism is wrong or racism is bad. Why would you even have a discussion about that? It's the same with tolerance. How can you have a lecture where you would even question the idea of tolerance? Because tolerance, he writes, has become part of the Western plausibility structure, an assumed value. Now, definitions are important. So being an American, he quotes from Webster's dictionary, an excellent dictionary, I might add, and he said this is how tolerance has been defined. Oxford Dictionary has a very similar definition. Tolerance, to recognise and respect others' beliefs, practices, etc., without necessarily agreeing or sympathising. Tolerance, to put up with, to bear without repugnance, as in he tolerates his brother-in-law. Under the older view of tolerance, a person might be judged tolerant if, while holding strong views, he or she insisted that others had the right to dissent from those views and argue their own cases, even convince you of their case. The assumptions behind that old definition, if I can call it old, I don't think it's old, it's a definition which is still there, but the assumptions behind it is that there's objective truth out there of differing kinds. It's our duty to pursue it, and free inquiry must be encouraged. The university is meant to encourage this kind of free inquiry, in case you're wondering. The different parties in a dispute believe their position to be the right one, and the opposing position to them to be wrong. And they're not upset about that. We're having a discussion here. I believe this, you don't, you believe something different. We can listen and respect each other. We're not going to agree, and in fact you're going to try and convince me to change my mind, and I'm going to try and do the same. We can do that in a respectful way. That's okay. Thirdly, nevertheless, each party holds that the best way of uncovering the truth and persuading the other person is with reason, not coercion. through the unhindered exchange of ideas, no matter how wrong they consider the opposing ideas to be. So it's not, your views are so stupid and horrible, I'm not going to even discuss them with you. No, that's not tolerance. Opponents must not be silenced or crushed, but rather respected and listened to respectfully. Carson says that there's been a little bit of a tweak with a new definition. An Encarta, is that an interweb dictionary? I think it is. Tolerance, acceptance of different views. This is a quote. The accepting of the differing views of people, for example, in religious or political matters, and fairness toward the people who hold these different views. Notice a subtle change there. Acceptance of different views. The assumptions behind this, philosophical assumptions that he teases out in his book, is that there's no one view that's exclusively true. We've got beyond that now. We no longer believe that on certain, foundational things. Strong views are just the same as strong preferences. We must be tolerant, not because we can distinguish the right path from the wrong path, but because all paths are equally right. So Leslie Armour, the Professor Emeritus of Philosophy in the University of Ottawa, sounds impressive. He says the virtuous citizen is to be one who tolerates everything except intolerance. Now let me ask you, thinking university students, what is the fatal flaw of this new definition and of Armour's point? The virtuous citizen is the one who tolerates everything except intolerance. What's the flaw here? What's the contradiction? Doesn't it assume an objective truth that stands over things? So jump down to my counterfeit freedom and new absolutism there, that quote. Carson writes, under the aegis of the new tolerance, no absolutism is permitted except for the absolute prohibition of absolutism. Tolerance rules, except that there must be no tolerance for those who disagree with this particular definition of tolerance. See, it's not that, oh no, we know that there's no meta-narratives anymore, there's no objective truth. It's just saying, no, this is the new objective truth. Do you see that? There's a paradox to that. There's a hypocrisy to that. There's been a subtle shift. Just jump back for a minute. I've got a for example there. Carson writes, Christians do think that Jesus is the only way to God, but does that make them intolerant? Well, he writes, in the former sense of intolerant, not at all. Because you don't have to agree with that point of view. It's what Christians believe, and they'll go to their death defending that truth, actually. And they think it would be a good thing for you to come and share that belief too. It would be the best thing in the world for you to believe that, in fact. And so we evangelise. But in the new definition, any sort of exclusive truth claim is widely viewed as a sign of gross intolerance. So you see how that definition has changed. It's become problematic so that a person can be called intolerant, not because they're rude, they're not listening, or they're coercive, but because they hold an absolutist point of view, a unique point of view. Carson wants to push back and say that's actually not genuine pluralism, and this gets back to what Georgina was saying, that there's actually a right kind of pluralism. Within the broader culture is facilitated when there is a strong Christian voice loyal to the scripture, as well as strong Muslim voices, sceptical voices, Buddhist voices, atheistic voices. That is, if there's going to be genuine inquiry and a genuine pluralism, these voices need to be heard on their own terms. Genuine pluralism within the broader culture is not fostered when, in the name of tolerance, none of these voices can say that any of the others are wrong, and when this stance is the only ultimate virtue. So Carson is saying we have a problem here, that the definition has suddenly shifted to being tolerance is now no longer the Muslim believes what the Muslim believes and is going to affirm that and seek to convince you of that. The Christian, likewise the Jew, likewise the Buddhist, if you like. It's changed now so that to say, no, this is the truth claim is now seen, even just the assertion of that is seen as wrong. What's the problem of that? Well, I've got a little Andy rant here, which I might read out, and then I'll get the rant out of the way. It says, how is it that the intellectual fundamentalism of the new so-called tolerance can provide any kind of real or lasting foundation or objective authority for goodness, truth, doing harm, protecting society and its victims? The avoidance of offence, crying peace, peace where there is no peace, fails to guarantee any of these values. Despite the espoused heroic relativism of the West, we inconsistently and desperately seek to cling to absolutes for which we no longer have any ethical or philosophical basis. So in practice, even the most fervent relativist, when confronted with real evil, feels compelled to say, how can this be? This must not be. Maybe we're a bit like the teenage rebel who says, I hate you, mum and dad, while continue to be protected, clothed, fed, and have their Sex Pistols records paid for by the same, naively believing that we're the first generation to have come of age. In actual fact, we act to destroy the very foundation our culture is built upon. We're rebels without a clue, confusing, distorting, perverting, finally losing any kind of moral compass which we might pass on to future generations. Holding tolerance, so defined as an absolute value, becomes a dangerously arrogant and hypocritically absolutist defeat of belief. Getting a bit excited here, for it rules out of court the possibility of being able to hold an opposing point of view. As a direct result, individuals and communities lose their right to even be listened to. We condemn what we do not like as bigotry, while the loudest, most humorous voices of smirking juvenilia win out. I'm not going to mention anything on the ABC. Anyone who thinks that X is just a dangerous idiot and a bigot and deserves our scorn and condemnation and so on. So that's my rant. What's really going on? I'll calm down and let's come back to Carson. We're failing to recognise the truth about our hearts. And that is that the failure to recognise the evil in our own hearts is precisely what convinces so many of us that our opinions and motives are above reproach, while those who contradict us are stupid or malign. We're not really seeing, as touched on before with that comment, the log in our own eye. J. Darrell Charles, who Carson quotes, says, what was a public virtue, tolerance, a wonderful public virtue that enables, liberal democratic society to exist actually, and that kind of discussion to happen and people to be able to live together. What once was a public virtue in its prior state becomes a vice if and when it ceases to care for truth, ignores the common good, and disdains the values that uphold a community. The culture of tolerance in which we presently find ourselves is a culture in which people believe nothing, possess no clear concept of right and wrong, and are remarkably indifferent to this precarious state of affairs. Tolerance becomes indistinguishable from an intractably intolerant relativism. It particularly becomes scary when it starts to be government legislated. That if we get the government to make laws and legislate, so that perhaps starting with good motives at first, so that these people are not ostracised or these people are not offended. But if tolerance is an absolute value, then there'll be a whole lot of assumed ethics that determine what should be tolerated and what should not be tolerated. Becomes a new form of intolerance. The state, as Carson puts it, can easily become a master instead of a servant. If there's nothing that can, critique, government legislation is not enough. How is that legislation determined? How is government critiqued? And that's the true horror story of the atheistic regimes of the 20th century, who said the 20th century will be the great age of graduating from God. Nietzsche has taught us that God is dead. We can build godless societies where human beings are at the centre. But the atheistic regimes killed more people, literally tens of millions of people, more than in the previous 20 centuries put together. And for a historical account of and critique of atheism as a philosophical and social movement, this book is another book you should read by Alistair McGrath. He's an Oxford academic, he's also a Christian, called The Twilight of Atheism. And one of the chapters there, he's a little bit cheeky, but he's factual as well. When people say religions cause death because they're intolerant and they just end up in killing people, McGrath wants to say, I agree with you that there's a huge amount of human evil that has come in the form of human religion, but let's just get some historical perspective here about the fruit of a godless society if you're going to be consistent. It's a very interesting book, and a historical survey. Carson, building on this, wants to say, a long heritage of reflection argues that if freedom of religion is progressively trimmed, it's only a matter of time before freedom more comprehensively envisioned is also progressively trimmed. It's not, and this was true for the American Constitution apparently, it's not for nothing that freedom of religion is often called the first freedom. Not merely in historical sequence, but it's in its foundational power. So if you refuse people the freedom of religion, then you're actually saying, I want to suggest to you that there is a meta-narrative, there's an objective morality and a way of viewing the world that needs to trump even your view of God. It starts to get a bit scary. Carson goes on. He wants to say, so what is lurking behind this new kind of fundamentalism of the West? Again, he's being a bit cheeky. So those who want to say tolerance will say downward fundamentalism, but there's a new kind of fundamentalism growing in the West, and he wants to say that the new tolerance rushes on to actually support moral relativism. It's not a vacuum. There's something there, and it's called moral relativism. So that the new tolerance becomes, ironically, a very moralising support of moral relativism. So some of the people who are saying, don't judge, Carson's saying, are sounding a bit judgmental, and quite strongly so. Kathleen Sullivan is a leading legal academic in the States, and she is quite open and honest to her students. This is what she is saying should be changed in the States and more broadly in the West. She writes, the free exercise of religion implies the free exercise of non-religion, the banishment of religion from the public square. So she's saying that the continuing presence of religion and all these little religious arguments, or religion wanting to comment about legislation and things, no, got to get rid of that. In the name of neutrality. Is it neutrality? The banishment of religion from the public square. The correct baseline, she writes and lectures, for freedom of religion is not unfettered religious liberty, but rather religious liberty, note this, insofar as it is consistent with the establishment of the secular moral order. So that's, to me, horrifyingly honest. She's saying, yes, we'll allow freedom of religion as long as it conforms to the worldview of a secular moral order. See the new authority that's come in. See the new kind of intolerance. It's a new kind of religion, a new kind of fundamentalism, Carson would argue. Carson responds, while the secularist wants all other religions, that's telling, because he's implying that secularism could be seen as a kind of religion, a godless kind of religion, if you like. While the secularist wants all other religions to retreat to the private sphere, keep your religion to yourself, You know, what are you doing standing on that street corner or putting that sign up or putting that book in a public place or advertising that lecture? We're not at that point at the university, but there are universities where it's illegal for Christians to gather and other religious groups to have religious meetings. They need to meet off campus. This is true of our friends in Slovenia. They'll tell you this. So they meet off campus. While the secularist wants all other religions to retreat to the private sphere, he or she insists that secularists have the right to control the public sphere because they're right, completely unaware that they are trying to impose their worldview on others who disagree with it. Okay, so polemical, a negative critique there. What are some ways forward? Here are some ways that we might respond as Christians, or as the Christians might respond. So, love has got to be key. Billy Connolly has a point if his point is, I find when religious people are unloving and intolerant in that sense, I don't like that. And we should say, yeah, you know what, I don't like that either. I don't like that either. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13, if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, truth, I know the truth, and if I have faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. Love is not proud. Love does not delight in evil but rejoices with the truth. Love never fails. So the first thing, we need to start from a humble stance. If Christians or the church are being accused of being intolerant for good reasons, we need to fess up to that and accept that and say, actually, you know what? We're right. And Jesus has already criticised us, just as he criticised the Pharisees for being intolerant of people that they were looking down on. We need to fess up to that. Love must characterise us. We might be right, but if we don't have love, we are nothing. So Carson writes, of all people, Christians ought to know that they're not one whit socially superior to anyone else. They talk about a great saviour, but they're not to think of themselves as a great people. You know, we're right, everyone else is wrong. No. That kind of tolerance should be encouraged. We know a great saviour, but we're excited about him because we know how much we need to be saved. Right? I'll skip the Thistleton quote and I'll move on to Carson's 10 words. This is adapted from his final chapter, A Way Forward. Another book needs to be written here. Someone here can write this book, The Next Generation. This is adapted from his final chapter. How do we respond? Well, he firstly says, expose the new tolerance as moral and epistemological bankruptcy. That's what he's trying to do in this book. So here's some quotable quotes from quotable people. Chesterton wrote, tolerance is the virtue of a man or woman, he's writing in the early 20th century, without convictions. B.B. Warfield wrote, there can be no real tolerance in a mind which has no strong convictions and no firm grasp of truth. Let's not be afraid to enter the fray and enter the debate and enter the discussion. Preserve a place for truth. Don't be embarrassed that we think, for example, that God has spoken, and while we must never claim to know God exhaustively, because he's God and we're people, and we never will know him exhaustively, we can know him truly. Not because we're so smart, but because God's so merciful and he reveals what he wants to reveal about himself. That's good news. We can know the truth. Thirdly, expose the new tolerance's condescending arrogance. I might say do that in a really humble and careful way. I think Carson does that most of the time in the book. You can read it for yourself and decide whether it's the kind of book you'd want to lend to someone who wasn't a Christian. There's some people I would lend it to. Other people I'd go, you know what, I agree with you, Don, but it's pretty full on. Anyway, you can decide that. Fourthly, insist that the the new tolerance is not progress. Here's quoting someone else. We must face the disturbing dilemma that modern liberal democracy needs God, but that God is not as liberal or as democratic as we would like him to be. So what that guy is basically trying to say is, look, let's let's have a genuine look at our history and see where this freedom of inquiry in practice has actually come from. But we can't make God a slave to our philosophy, no matter how fair and good we think it is. Fifthly, distinguish between empirical diversity. There's a plurality of things. I can't speak now. It's probably a good thing. And the inherent goodness of all diversity. Yeah, there's lots of different things. There's lots of exciting things, lots of great food to eat, lots of different things, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's all good. And our culture recognises that, which is why there were rightly, for example, protests that led to reforms to do with genital mutilation amongst women in some Islamic tribes in Africa. People said, that's not good. That's not good. To give it a dramatic but real example. Sixthly, challenge secularism's ostensible neutrality and superiority. It's not really neutral, let's be honest here. We're all working from a worldview. Practice encourage civility. Listen first, speak later. That's really important. Talk to the people who go around doing the surveys. They're working really hard to do this, to listen first, to really understand. I want to understand. I want to get to know you. I'm not just going to speak at you, as it were. Evangelise, that is, keep speaking the truth in love. Do it because you love God and you love your fellow image bearers. Be prepared to suffer. Jesus has already warned us of that. We don't need the Intolerance of Tolerance to teach us that. There's some quotes there from Peter Adam and his recent commentary on Esther, which is a really actually interesting book of the Bible, Esther, to read in terms of when you're in the minority. And he makes some interesting applications there. 10thly, delight in and trust God. I'll skip the Carson quote. We've heard enough of him, and we'll go right down to C.S. Lewis, who's always quotable. He writes, look, there are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendours. That's what people are. Our charity must be a real costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. No mere tolerance or indulgence, which parodies love as flippancy, parodies merriment. In other words, when you love someone, you won't just say it's all good. You know, the guy sitting next to his mates at the pub when the guy's whinging about his wife, if he was really a mate, he wouldn't just, women are dumb, and your wife, she's a slave, No, if he was a really good mate, he'd say, mate, come on. Do you know what I mean? You hear what I'm saying. Sorry, there's a bit of a blokey example. Final page, and we really need to finish. 4 minutes on the Mickey Mouse clock. A thought experiment to leave with you. Imagine if Jesus had said, tolerate one another, as I have tolerated you. Put up with, maybe, or say, it's all good. I don't know, Jesus actually loves, doesn't he? And love mercifully, gently and strongly sometimes says the hard word. He actually said, love one another as I have loved you. It's more costly, it's more involving, because if I just have a happy tolerating discussion, or if I just sort of go on my tour through different countries, to really get down and get to the point where, hey, you know what, we're going to disagree, but I'm going to keep loving you. This is the kind of full-blooded love that Jesus is talking about. What Jesus actually did. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. I'll leave it at that. Helen's telling me we need to finish. I don't know if there's time for questions. There's 3 minutes left. I'll hand over to Helen.
We're going to finish, so I'm not sure whether people need the theatre. But if no one needs the theatre week and you've got questions, we'll do it that way. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. This is the first of a 4-part series thinking about challenging some of the assumptions. Not just we have, but I think most of the people around us have. So just trying to actually work at some of those assumptions, because it's really hard to start talking about Jesus when all of these things are swirling around. Now, Andy, the topic we've got next week is why a loving God needs to judge, which actually picks up very well where Andy left off. What does real love actually look like? Does it look like acceptance of whatever anyone chooses to do? So I think it'll follow on really nicely. If you do have a friend or two who you think this could be good for them to hear, make sure they know what they're coming to, right? Don't trick them. It's loving to be honest, right? Give them an opt-out. But it may be that there's someone who that would be a helpful thing for them to hear. I'm just pushing a little bit. Okay? Thank you for coming.
Indeed.